Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror in detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of Wendigo horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story. In the heart of the vast woodlands surrounding the Great Lakes of Canada, where ancient trees whispered secrets and shadows danced among the leaves, lived a man named Gabriel Cross. Tall and weathered, his face etched with lines that told tales of countless battles against the supernatural, Gabriel was a seasoned Wendigo hunter. Wendigos, ancient spirits cursed to wander the forests, consumed by insatiable hunger, were the bane of the woodlands. Gabriel had dedicated his life to tracking and eliminating these malevolent creatures, protecting the unsuspecting towns and villages that bordered the wilderness. His reputation spread far and wide, and those who had witnessed his prowess spoke of a man with eyes that held the weight of the countless souls he had set free. It all began when Gabriel was just a boy. His father, a skilled hunter himself, had perished under mysterious circumstances in the woods. Whispers of Wendigos haunted the small village, and Gabriel's curiosity grew into a fervent determination to uncover the truth behind his father's demise. As the years passed, Gabriel trained under the guidance of the village elders, honing his skills in tracking, archery, and the mystical arts passed down through generations. Armed with a silver-edged bow and a blade etched with ancient symbols, he embarked on a lifelong quest to rid the world of the Wendigo curse. The woodlands were treacherous, with towering pines casting long shadows that seemed to come alive in the moonlight. Gabriel moved with the silence of a stalking panther, his senses heightened by years of communion with the spirits of the forest. Each step was deliberate, every breath calculated as he navigated the ancient terrain. His first encounter with a Wendigo was seared into his memory. The creature, once a man consumed by greed, emerged from the shadows with eyes that glowed like embers. Gabriel's silver arrow pierced its heart, but the Wendigo's scream echoed through the woods, sending shivers down his spine. The battle was fierce, but Gabriel emerged victorious, his father's blade now tainted with the blood of the supernatural. The Great Lakes woodlands were vast, and Gabriel's reputation attracted the attention of those in need. Villages plagued by disappearances and unexplained deaths sought his expertise, and he answered the call without hesitation. Wendigo after Wendigo fell beneath his relentless pursuit, but the creatures grew more cunning, adapting to his tactics. In one particularly chilling encounter, Gabriel faced a Wendigo that seemed to manipulate the very shadows around it. It moved with an ethereal grace, and its howls reverberated through the trees, disorienting its prey. But Gabriel, guided by the spirits of the forest, stood firm. The battle raged on, a dance between a lone hunter and a malevolent force. In the end, Gabriel's determination prevailed, and the Wendigo's cursed essence dissipated into the night. As the years passed, Gabriel's legend grew. He became a symbol of hope for those living on the edge of the wilderness, a guardian who stood between humanity and the ancient darkness that lurked within the woods. Yet, with each victory, Gabriel knew that the battle was far from over. The Wendigos were relentless, and as long as the Great Lakes woodlands stood, their cursed spirits would persist. In the quiet moments between battles, Gabriel found solace beneath the towering trees. He communed with the spirits, seeking guidance and understanding. The woods had become his home, and the spirits his companions. And so, with bow in hand and father's blade at his side, Gabriel Cross continued his endless quest, a Wendigo hunter bound by duty and a legacy etched in the heart of the ancient woodlands. Second story. There are things in the woods that will never be explained. It was almost 15 years ago now that I first met one of the most interesting people I know. True to that nature, I also met him in one of the most interesting and unexpected ways. I was out hiking on a trail in Washington state. It was a remote area, but one which I was fairly familiar with. On that particular day, I decided to venture far beyond the hiking trail I normally took to just for the sake of exploration. After some time, I entered a sunlit gully which led up to a local mountain, rife with blooming conifers and serene, glistening pines. I was alone that day, and felt my soul rejuvenate a bit with every breath of the fresh mountain air. After probably 20 minutes I was well off the beaten trail, and I found something worrying. I was about to take another step when I paused mid-stride, seeing a circular, jagged, metal ring laying just behind a small shrub. It was a good thing I didn't put my foot down, as the ring proved to be an improvised bear trap. "The hell you doin' out here?" A gruff male voice suddenly shouted from somewhere unseen. I looked around, trying to find the person who had spoken, when he chose to step forward and reveal himself. An older man sporting a long gray beard then emerged from the brush. He had amber skin, long grayish-black dreadlocks and a scar on his right cheek. He wore a raggedy brown coat that looked hand-woven, and old jeans patched in multiple spots by mismatched fabric. His eyes burned like campfires, and his hands clutched a bolt-action rifle while his lip cradled a sizable wad of chew. "I asked you a question, son. What are you doing here?" After fumbling on my words for a moment, I was finally able to piece together a response. "I was just out hiking, sorry, I didn't know anyone lived out here." The man seemed to silently inspect me for a moment. I felt my pulse soar in my chest, as I wondered what he intended on doing. We were, after all, completely alone out there. "You see that trap back there, son?" He pointed to the same trap I had narrowly avoided stepping on a minute earlier. I nodded and swallowed hard. He tilted to the side and spewed a mouthful of tobacco spit into the dirt. "Guess that means I gotta hide 'em better." He stared at me completely deadpan, and I felt my heart plunge into the depths of my stomach. I thought he was some maniac hillbilly cannibal hellbent on having me for lunch then, but then he suddenly burst into a fit of raspy laughter. I was left there confused and partially horrified as the man continued to cackle for several seconds. "Oh, I'm just kidding, son." He wiped a tear from his eye and recomposed himself as I continued silently debating whether or not I should run like hell. He slung the rifle over his shoulder and smiled at me. "Apologies, buddy, my wife always said my sense of humor was a bit dark." I eyed the man over, and he suddenly seemed less sinister than he had a moment ago. There was a sense of jubilance in his gaze, like he was genuinely happy to see me. It's hard to explain, but it kept me from running. I forced a laugh myself. Good thing for both of us, I guess. This hiking has given me a major case of swamp ass. Can't imagine I'd taste too good. The man burst out into laughter once more, and this time I joined in. In that moment, I knew I had found a new friend. The man formally introduced himself not long after as Mark Hastings. After conversing for a while, he told me that he had lived in that particular area for a couple years at least, though admitted he didn't know exactly how long he'd been there. He said he left the city life behind in 96 foot, and seemed quite surprised when I told him the current year was 2020. Mark's accent was something which struck me as quite interesting, as it was one I couldn't quite pin down. He had a slight southern drawl and yet at times also sounded as though he may have had a bit of British influence as well. He pronounced words like again as again, and had a strange vocal inflection. The best way I can really describe it as the way someone speaks in old black and white movies, proper and yet somehow country. We got to talking and he told me more about himself. He said he used to do construction back in the day, but when his wife got sick with cancer it really changed things for him. He said she battled it for almost 3 years, but eventually lost the fight. Afterwards he was left alone and with a mountain of medical bills to account for. Rather than pay them off, and attempt to move forward, Mark chose a different path. It's funny, you know. You work your ass off for years, begin building the life you want with the woman of your dreams, and then it all just falls apart for no good reason. Then when you're at your lowest, good old Uncle Sam comes in and slaps you with a bill you ain't never gonna pay back. So I say, to hell with them. To hell with their taxes and debt, out here I am truly free. There ain't nothing left for me in the real world anyways. There was a distinct glimmer of pain behind his gray eyes as he said it, and I felt myself feeling sorry for him. He wasn't at all what I expected when we first met. Just a normal guy whose life fell apart through no fault of his own. In a way I found it sort of admirable. The system beat him down, and rather than just accept it and be a good little wage slave, he left it all behind with one big middle finger. I visited Mark pretty regularly after that, and tried to make the trek out to see him at least once a month. He always seemed to have a smile on his face when I came to visit. Soon enough he even invited me back to his cabin for a fresh meal and some drinks. I was a bit hesitant at first, but decided to accept. Part of me expected him to prepare a meal of squirrels and tree bark when he first offered, but I couldn't have been more wrong. Mark made us a fresh rabbit stew with some homegrown potatoes and bread he had made from scratch. On top of that he even had his own home-brewed ale to wash it all down. It was surprisingly delicious, and really made me admire Mark more for his resourcefulness. He wasn't just some half-assed camper, he was truly a man of the land. His cabin was reminiscent of one that would have been used by early 18th century trappers. A handcrafted stone chimney was his only source of heat, while animal pelts covered the walls and strips of meat were drying on his jerky rack. There were 2 couches in the main room constructed of whittled wood and bearing hand-woven pillows stuffed with feathers. He had no electronics of any kind, claiming he didn't need those technologic doohickeys anyways. Mark had 2 bloodhounds, Raleigh and Daisy, that lived there with him and were his only real companions. I eventually asked if he ever missed civilization or got lonely out there, but he immediately refuted the question. For a while, yeah, but not anymore. It's easy to forget about society when society already forgot about you. I really grew to admire Mark, and even cherish our friendship. Over our many meetings he would tell me stories about his life. Told me all about his business and his wife before she passed. The way he spoke about her in particular truly broke my heart. He was a man who met his soulmate and built a life he loved with her, only to have it all ripped away by the cruel hands of fate. More than anything though, Mark was always ready to tell me how much he hated the government. I think that was what made me like him the most. One night he and I were drinking some of his homebrewed honey ale and chilling around his campfire. He had just got done telling a story about a 5-point buck that he had narrowly missed a few weeks earlier. He finished with admitting that he heard some weird, loud noise from the woods that scared it off before he could fire. That detail got me thinking, and since I've always been a fan of the paranormal and whatnot, I figured I'd go ahead and ask him. You ever seen anything really creepy out here? Mark's eyes opened wide, and he immediately lowered the mug from his lips. He wiped the suds from his bushy beard, and stared down at the campfire for a couple seconds. I could tell he knew exactly what I meant. He then chuckled and rocked in his chair with a smug grin. "Zach, I tell ya, you don't know creepy until you've spent some time out here." He then began to tell me a story of when he had first began living out there. He said it took him close to a year to finally assemble his cabin, at least partially. During that time, he and his dogs were living in a simple tent. Mark said that a couple weeks after living there, he started noticing something odd. Every once in a while, he'd awake to find mutilated animals just outside the perimeter of his camp. Usually it was just small creatures like rabbits, birds, and squirrels, but it didn't stay that way. Over time Mark began finding more and more corpses left at his camp. He thought it was the work of a puma at first, despite the fact that the corpses seemed to retain most of the meat. He quickly rethought that though when he found an actual puma corpse one morning. He said most of the animals had slash marks along their sides and necks, and many had been disemboweled. He began thinking it was the work of some deranged person, but even that thought didn't last long. One night as he was preparing to turn in for the evening, he heard a rustling sound coming from within the forest. He ducked down underneath some timber, in hopes of catching a glimpse of the culprit. Both of his dogs were already chained up for the night, so he knew it couldn't be one of them. A figure then emerged deeper in the woods. Mark said he didn't see the entire thing, but he could tell it was bipedal and scrawny. I asked if it could have been a bear with mange, but Mark claimed it was way too skinny for that. He said he'd seen sick bears before, and they looked, and moved nothing like that thing. Mark initially planned on trying to shoot it, but after seeing that he admitted he didn't think that would have been a good idea. The creature dropped something on the perimeter, which Mark discovered the following morning was the corpse of a raccoon. The thing's head then tilted, and appeared to stare directly towards Mark. They just stared there in silence for several seconds, until the dogs began snarling voraciously from inside the tent. They must have caught its scent, and the thing suddenly crouched on all fours and dashed off back into the woods as the dogs went ballistic. Mark didn't know what he had seen that night, and apparently never saw it again. To me, it sounded like a Wendigo or skinwalker based on his description. I told him that, but he had no idea what those things were. He seemed to think the thing was actually leaving him gifts, but I wasn't so sure about that. I asked him about the typical creatures as seen in creepypasta and television lore. I mentioned the Wendigo, skinwalkers, Slender Man, the Rake, Siren Head and some of the well-known others, but Mark didn't seem to know anything about any of them. He did however know about something he called the Whistler. Apparently, ever since he had been out there, he heard an odd whistling sound on occasion. It started off as little more than a dull, barely audible noise in the distance. He said at times it would come closer, and at others it seemed like it was further away. Mark thought it was a bird for the longest time, but one night he found the truth. He was chopping wood, when suddenly the whistling noise emerged. This time it was different, and this time it was closer than ever before. Suddenly there was a rustling noise from behind him. Mark spun back, but only saw a few branches bristling back and forth. He then heard the whistle again louder than ever before. He looked up and there it was. About 20 feet up in a large oak tree was some kind of figure. Mark described it as, kind of human with a head that looked like some fucked up eel. He said he saw the thing stare down at him with beady black eyes. He just froze, and before he could do anything the thing suddenly leapt from the tree. It crashed into another one further away, and continued whistling and crashing as it blended into the depths of the woods. I didn't know what to say to that. I have heard legends about the whistlers out in the woods, but never heard about anyone having actually seen them. The way he described it sounded quite creative, and I wondered whether he was capable of an imagination so elaborate or if he had actually seen what he claimed. I asked him whether he thought this whistler was the same creature that was leaving him corpses, but he just shook his head. Without being prompted, he told me another tale about hearing voices in the woods sometimes. Sometimes it was that of an old man, sometimes that of a young girl, and sometimes it didn't sound human at all. I wondered whether my new friend was perhaps schizophrenic or suffering from some mental illness that caused him to hear these things. I obviously didn't tell him that, but his claims had to be met with some amount of skepticism. What do you think it was? Mark leaned back, and his head swiveled on his shoulders. No clue, son, and part of me hopes I never find out. He went on to explain that he'd continued hearing voices on occasion, but never saw who or what was making them. He seemed to think all the voices were coming from the same entity though. Without being prompted, he took the conversation an entirely new accusatory direction. It's the goddamn government, Zach, messin' with things they got no business messin' with. He then delved into a conspiratorial rant about how the government and specifically the guys in black trucks that were up to some really shady antics. He said they knew about the gates in the forest, and had been actively trying to open them. He didn't elaborate on what exactly he meant by that. You see them out here? You know, government, CIA. Mark looked confused. CIA? He asked. It was my turn to look confused then. Yeah, Central Intelligence Agency. You know, Men in Black, MK Ultra and whatnot. Mark still appeared slightly puzzled. I didn't understand how a guy like him who hated the government to such an extreme degree had apparently never heard of the mother of all conspiracy agencies like the CIA. He then seemed to have an epiphany and his eyes lit up in recognition. Oh yeah. I forgot all about them. He then laughed and shook his head as he downed another swig of ale. My memory ain't what it used to be, I'm afraid. Goddamn, how could I forget them? Well, in my defense, they don't carry no badges out here. And their vehicles don't exactly advertise who they work for. He paused and rubbed the back of his neck. But you've seen them out here. Mark met my eyes and nodded. Oh yeah. Mark told me that one time he had been tracking elk through the woods in late autumn. He'd followed the trail for a few miles, when he suddenly heard a noise coming from a grove up ahead. It sounded nothing like a bear though, and more like several people arguing. Mark crept slowly forward, taking care to not disturb the foliage and remain out of sight. After a couple seconds he saw the outline of several people emerge in the grove. One man was on his knees in the center, while 4 men in black suits surrounded him. The man on his knees had open wounds and bruises upon his face, and his clothing was torn and tattered. He was begging the others for mercy, but they didn't appear to be the forgiving type. 2 of the men were speaking quietly to one another, while the other 2 stood watch over their apparent captive. The man on his knees was dressed in white, with Mark describing his clothes as looking like a surgeon's uniform, or maybe the attire of someone from an insane asylum. He listened but couldn't make out what the 2 other men were talking about, but they were clearly arguing. The man on his knees appeared to be weeping softly. Mark said he didn't know what to do, and before he could do anything, one of the 2 men who had previously been arguing stepped away. Without a word, the man stepped behind the captive, lifted a pistol to the back of the man in white's head and pulled the trigger. Mark described seeing a splash of red, but said the weapon made a lot less noise than he thought it would. The man in white went limp and fell face first into the dirt. Holy shit, I said, mouth falling agape as Mark concluded his story. I eyed him closely, but didn't see any aura of boasting in his eyes. They didn't twinkle like that of a man who tried telling a fabricated story to simply amaze or impress an audience. He didn't meet my gaze at all as a matter of fact, he just clasped his hands in front of his mouth and stared into the campfire with a somber gaze. It was clear to me that what he was either an accomplished actor, or what he had witnessed truly haunted him. Poor boy, couldn't we been much older than you? I wish I would have done something, but I just ran. He shook his head, and his eyes seemed to glaze over. I just stay quiet, as there was nothing I could think to say. After a couple moments of lingering silence, Mark finally spoke again. Zach. I gotta tell you a secret. He looked in the eye, and I gulped down the lump in my throat. I don't particularly care for the government. I chuckled and Mark let out a small laugh. I think you've mentioned that once or twice. I replied with a laugh. Yeah, suppose I have, but it's not just because the IRS is after my ass. It's because of things like what I saw that day. It's because government corrupts by its very nature. It takes what it wants and destroys those who oppose it. Ain't no justice, no considerations and nothing you can do about it. Now I don't know the details of what they were disagreeing on that night, but I guarantee you, that boy didn't deserve what he got. I nodded, but wasn't entirely convinced that he witnessed what he thought he had. You sure it was government that did that? Could have been drug dealers or mafia. Mark hunched his shoulders and gave a snide chuckle. What's the difference? I chuckled, but didn't have a response. Well, I see why you'd think that, but that's because you ain't spent as much time out here as I have. But what you don't know, and what no one is supposed to know, is about the tunnels. I peeked an eyebrow at that comment. Tunnels? Mark grinned and nodded back. There are a series of tunnels that run deep below the earth. Gotta be a couple dozen of 'em within a few miles of us now. Government knows about 'em, maybe they built 'em but, well, I doubt that. I think they're just interested by what's inside. And that is? I asked, now on the edge of my seat. Mark scoffed and shook his head. I have no idea, but it's gotta be something bad. I was a bit disappointed with that answer, but Mark immediately drew my curiosity back. You wanna see one of 'em? I nodded without even really thinking. Mark grinned. I figured you might. It's a bit late in the day to go now, so would I say we head out there first thing in the morning? I agreed without hesitance, and promised to return the next morning to meet up with Mark. I walked back down the trail that day with my imagination running wild. As I mentioned, I liked Mark and very much enjoyed our conversations. To me, he was somewhat like a compassionate grandfather with a plethora of exuberant stories that may or may not have been slightly exaggerated. I thought about all he had told me, about the animal carcasses, the whistling thing, the voices, and the tunnels. I wanted to believe him, but urban legends abound in our day and age. I was well aware that perhaps he had just concocted these stories after his decades of isolation. I needed to see some proof for myself. Dew glistened on the leaves illuminated by the crimson sun rising over the hills as I set off the next morning. It was a bit chilly as I walked, but thoughts of the unknown kept me warm as I walked. Before long I arrived at Mark and I's usual meeting spot, and found him already waiting there for me. He greeted me and without hesitation we began the trek out to his spot. We made small talk on the way, mostly about asinine topics like my family and work. After maybe 15 minutes of walking, we rounded a small bend tucked behind a small grove of trees. Mark stepped out in front and turned to face me, he then grinned and outstretched his hand to the right. I followed his gesture, and felt my jaw strike the floor. There was an opening in the side of the hill that was lined with smoothed stone and bricks. It was quite enormous, with the perimeter having to have been at least 15 feet wide. The opening appeared collapsed and the entrance was filled with rubble and dirt, looking as though someone had intentionally yet clumsily sealed it. "This is the tunnel?" I asked. Mark nodded. "One of many, but it wasn't sealed up like this last time I was here." "How long ago was that?" Mark shrugged. "Dunno, maybe a year or two." I looked back at the collapsed tunnel. It was clear someone had gone through a great deal of effort to construct it, but the construction didn't look like a mining operation. I'm no expert in mining or anything, but I can't imagine they would spend time laying brick and creating such a wide entrance. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but the more curious fact was why it had been sealed up. I thought maybe it was just vandals, but that explanation somehow didn't satisfy. "What's inside?" I asked. Mark paused for a moment, and stared towards the wreckage. He then shook his head and spat into the dirt. "Bad things." I hoped he'd elaborate on that, but he didn't. "I mean, it'd have to be for someone to seal it up like this, right? That's an impressive hole, would have taken a great deal of effort." He was right about that, but I still felt there was information he was withholding from me. "You think this is the government's work?" Mark nodded. Not a single doubt in my mind about it. Mark's head then suddenly flicked to the side and he stared out into the trees as if something had alerted him. I watched the color drain from his cheeks as his mouth pursed open. "We should go, I don't like lingering here for too long." I didn't argue, as clearly something had spooked him. He and I trekked back to his cabin, checking his snares on the way back. Mark found a pair of rabbits in his traps, and after swiftly snapping their necks he slung them over his shoulder. We got back to his cabin, and Mark set to work on harvesting the meat from the rabbits for his stew. I sat around, petting Daisy and Rally as they slobbered all over my knee and panted endlessly. "I don't think I ever told you about the scariest part of livin' out here, did I?" Mark asked. I looked up from the two dogs and stared at him, heart now beating with excitement. Mark sauntered over, carrying the meat of the rabbits along with a clump of chopped vegetables. He dumped the plate into the simmering cauldron on the fire, then took a seat across the fire. I stayed silent as he stared down at the flickering flames in deep thought. There are things out there that people don't know about. Creatures, places and things that would seem to defy all explanation. The advancement of society and technology has led people to believe they're safe, and for the most part, they're right. So long as they stay out of the woods, those things can't get them, but there is something that can. Mark paused and looked me dead in the eye. "I call it, the silence, dot." He paused as if to allow the words to accumulate the dread he felt they deserved. I had an inkling of an idea where the conversation was headed, but just waited for him to explain. There's been rumors about it for a very long time, and it's something that has been affecting humanity for centuries, if not millennia. People have only just begun to realize it, but if they knew the true extent of what's going on, well, no one would ever go into the woods again. He paused and leaned in to stir the pot a bit, before sitting back. People disappear, Zach. No reason for it, no explanation, and no bodies are ever found. The cases seem to defy all explanation, and it happens again and again. Mark then suddenly grunted and began rubbing his eye. Damn smoke, Sorry, where was I? The disappearances. I replied. Mark seemed suddenly hesitant, as if he didn't know whether he should continue. Yeah, the disappearances. I don't particularly like talking about this if I'm being honest, it's not really my business, but you're a good kid, Zach, and I know you come out here a lot, and I'd be devastated if anything were to happen to you. Dread crept around me like dozens of little spiders scurrying on my flesh. I couldn't help but raise my guard, and wonder where exactly this conversation was headed. Mark went on to tell me about this silence he mentioned. He said if ever I was walking through the woods and everything went completely silent, I was to drop to my knees and put my face in the dirt immediately. He said to stay that way until sounds returned to normal. And what if the sound doesn't come back? I asked, spine tingling with anxiety. Mark looked me dead in the eye, and his words offered nothing of comfort. Then God help you. He said no more about the subject, and I didn't push him on it. It was clear he really wasn't comfortable discussing it beyond his initial warning. If he had any theories about what was responsible, he didn't voice them. The whole conversation had given me strong missing 411 vibes, and I wondered whether he was referring to the same phenomenon. Both of us just sort of lingered in silence for a while as the stew finished cooking. A few minutes later Mark leaned in and scooped 2 servings into bowls, handing one of them to me. The stew was delicious as usual, and I happily scarfed it down as Mark provided his hounds with their dinner as well, although didn't so much as nibble on his own serving. What do you know about mimics? I don't know why exactly I asked, but the thought had suddenly arisen in my mind. Mark seemed to perk up, but yet stared back with a look of confusion that seemed to contradict his reaction. I'm sorry, what? Mimics. I clarified. Some people call them imposters, or liars. Things that look and try to act human but aren't. Mark stared back at me, and a small grin slithered onto his face. Now what would make you ask a question like that? Mark's grin evaporated and he stared back with something akin to contempt. Truth is, some of the things I'd seen from him made me question who he claimed he was. There was just a subtle wrongness to him in a way I've never felt the words to accurately describe. Just curious, I replied, staring back. Mark chuckled, but without any humor in his tone. Your kind always is. Ever since your brothers took up arms against one another in the War of Grey and Blue, your curiosity has been quite insatiable. You think this land belongs to you, like this country is your own personal proving grounds to pillage and destroy as you please. His form seemed to shift as he spoke, his eyes shrinking in their sockets and his skin seemed to twitch. His teeth bared like the fangs of a cougar, and his long black hair flowing like a clump of wild eels. He leaned forward, in a gaze that no longer seemed entirely human. Zach, there are things out here that your world of science and logic will never understand. And these things are better left alone. He and I just stared at one another, and I felt my heart beginning to thump away in my chest. I thought about his words, the War of Grey and Blue. Could he have been referring to the American Civil War? Why reference that event specifically? What year did you say you moved out here? I asked. Mark grinned again, now appearing more menacing than ever before. 96. 18. 96. I shook my head. I don't understand, I replied, shaking my head. Your kind never does. His voice had suddenly changed, becoming much more high-pitched like that of a young girl. His head cocked to the side, and his grin grew almost literally ear to ear as his mouth stretched impossibly wide. Your kind has conquered this world, both beast and nature bow at your might. You live in comfort, convinced that there is nothing that can hurt you anymore. His voice had changed again, sounding like a raspy, Scottish man with rolled R's. But you are wrong. His voice had changed again, like that of a young, rebellious boy resisting his parents' wishes in a juvenile defiance. Mark then stood, and his form extended, making him tower over me and the campsite. Even Daisy and Raleigh started altering their form, like they were also simply hiding their true form. I rose and backed away, no longer seeing Mark as the friendly hermit I had known him to be. I thought that moment would be my end, and that the beast which hid itself in the form of Mark was prepared to devour me whole. Before he did, I had one final question I had to ask. What are you? Mark chuckled, his form continuing to grow abhorrently inhuman. He then shook his monstrous head. Wrong question, his words bellowed forth, spoken in the chorus of 1,000 voices all in unison. I took another step back, wondering what it could have meant by that. It then struck me. What do you want? The thing I had once known as Mark stared down at me with an entirely inhuman gaze. To watch, and protect, we stared at one another, and I attempted to understand what was happening. After all he had told me, and his time devoted to actually speaking with me, part of me almost wanted to believe his words were meant to reassure me. Like he was conveying that it was me, or more generally humanity as a whole, he wished to protect. After ruminating on it for a while though, I don't think that's the case anymore. Why are you telling me all this? The thing I had once known as Mark grinned, as if that was the question he was waiting to hear. So that you can tell the world. And so, I have. I left Mark and that trail behind, and I have not been back since. That's why I'm here now, to tell the world as the thing I once knew as Mark instructed me to. I don't even know why or what exactly I'm supposed to be telling. Maybe that Mark is not human and that there are things in the woods that will never be fully understood, or maybe that he is watching, and something has given him a great deal of power for some reason. I wish I had more answers, but I had to share this, regardless of whether anyone will believe it. And needless to say, I don't think I'll be visiting Mark again anytime soon. Third story. In the remote wilderness of northern Canada, where the biting winds carried tales of ancient spirits, there existed a forest untouched by the hands of civilization. Towering pines loomed overhead, their branches entwined like skeletal fingers reaching out to the heavens. Beneath the thick canopy, a silence reigned, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a haunting glow across the snow-covered landscape. A group of 4 friends, eager for adventure, embarked on a winter camping trip to explore the mysteries that the vast wilderness held. Unbeknownst to them, something sinister lurked in the shadows, a malevolent force that had long been dormant, waiting for unsuspecting souls to awaken its insatiable hunger. As the friends trudged through the snow-laden terrain, the air grew colder and the atmosphere more oppressive. Unsettling whispers echoed through the trees, carried by the wind that seemed to carry the voice of the forest itself. They laughed off the unease, dismissing it as the product of overactive imaginations. Little did they know that the ancient spirits were watching, and a dark presence stirred in the depths of the woods. As night fell, the group set up camp, their flickering fire the only source of warmth and light. Around them, the woods seemed to come alive with eerie sounds. Branches creaked like mournful cries, and the shadows danced to an otherworldly rhythm. Unbeknownst to the friends, a pair of glowing eyes watched them from the darkness, hungry and filled with an insatiable thirst for flesh. The temperature plummeted, and the fire's feeble attempts to ward off the encroaching cold proved futile. A bone-chilling howl pierced the stillness, freezing the blood in their veins. The friends huddled closer, their eyes darting nervously between the trees. An unnatural wind whispered through the branches, carrying with it a name spoken in hushed tones, the Wendigo. Legend spoke of a creature that once was human but succumbed to the insatiable craving for human flesh. It transformed into a monstrous being with a heart as cold as the Arctic winds. The Wendigo was said to prowl the northern woods, hunting those foolish enough to wander into its territory. As the night wore on, the friends began to feel the weight of an unseen presence closing in. Shadows elongated, and the once friendly fire became a feeble barrier against the encroaching darkness. A figure emerged from the trees, a grotesque blend of human and beast, its emaciated form twisted and deformed. The Wendigo had found its prey. Panic set in as the friends scrambled to their feet, their breath visible in the frigid air. The creature's eyes glowed with an otherworldly hunger as it moved with unnatural speed, closing the distance between them. The forest itself seemed to conspire against the intruders, the trees bending and contorting as if bowing to the malevolent force that commanded them. The friends ran through the labyrinth of trees, their footsteps muffled by the snow that clung to the forest floor. But the Wendigo was relentless, its haunting wails echoing through the night, a chilling reminder of the fate that awaited those who dared to cross its path. One by one, the friends succumbed to exhaustion and fear, their bodies falling prey to the merciless predator that stalked them. The Wendigo, driven by an insatiable hunger, feasted upon their flesh, leaving behind only whispers of the once living souls that had ventured into its domain. As dawn broke, the forest fell silent once more, concealing the horrors that had transpired in its depths. The snow-covered landscape bore no trace of the friends who had sought adventure and found only a gruesome end. The ancient spirits watched in solemn silence as the Wendigo retreated into the shadows, its hunger momentarily sated, waiting for the next unsuspecting souls to wander into the woods of northern Canada. Fourth story. There's an ancient tribe residing in our local woods. When my dog ran off into the woods during one of our walks, I knew I couldn't chase after her right away. Everyone in our town knew that the woods weren't empty. There was something in there, and especially the older residents insisted that it was people. Or at least something akin to people. They called them the tribe. I never fully embraced these beliefs, but I still acted according to them. There were just too many things off about the woods for the tribe to be nothing but an old legend. The fact that everyone was utterly convinced the tribe was real in itself was cause for concern. I'd never heard of anybody venturing into the forest, not even to prove the saying wrong. There was nobody working there either, despite the area being so huge. If the woods were normal, chances are there'd be foresters and woodcutters or maybe even hunters in there, that's what I figured. Our pets usually stayed far away from the tree line as well. At that point, I had no idea why Chips, my dog, had gone off there in the first place. She had never shown any interest in the woods and had even seemed apprehensive about getting too close to them. That's why I always thought it safe to walk alongside the tree line. I was sure she'd never leave my side. Her tearing the leash from my hands and dashing off into the thicket that day had happened completely unexpectedly. At least I knew who to go to for advice. There's this guy named Duncan. He's very old, maybe even the oldest man in the entire town, and definitely the most knowledgeable. He hangs out at a small pub most of the time, so I was sure I'd find him there. I got on my way as fast as I could. When I arrived at the bar, I needed to stop for a moment to catch my breath before looking around inside. The interior was dark in its colors, the wood of the floor and the counter as well as the tables being of a warm, deep brown. The lights were just bright enough for me to easily spot the man I'd been looking for over in one of the corner tables. There weren't a lot of other people inside the pub at the time. Duncan lifted his head in mild surprise when he noticed me approaching. We weren't total strangers. In a town as small as ours basically everyone knew each other. "Hello," I gasped. He lifted his glass to me with a lazy smile of greeting but didn't say anything. "I need to go into the woods. My dog ran off." He gave me a nod as if to tell me to say no more. He went straight to business. "First off, go in there by yourself. They don't take kindly to groups and noise. And be respectful to those you meet inside." He lowered his head slightly. "You know, they don't refrain from leaving those woods because they don't want to. Does that mean they're trapped there or something?" "Not trapped. The woods are their home, and this is ours. And we've forbidden them from entering ours. That's why they don't come out." Duncan looked me over, his brows creased almost like he was trying to figure out if I'd understood the gravity of the situation. Seemingly satisfied, he nodded and went on. "The woods are big. Easy to get lost in. There's a single path through. It leads into the woods and it'll lead you back out. You're safe there. Follow it and you won't get lost." Duncan gave me a few seconds to let everything sink in before continuing once more. "You don't want to give anyone in there your real name. Names are taboo. Knowing your name will give them power over you, to be used in our world." His wording was ominously cryptic. "What do you mean by that?" I asked. "It means you won't be able to get rid of them." He sighed. "Never mind, just don't let it come to that. Make up a nickname or something and expect them to do the same. They're very careful with that kind of thing. That's easy enough to remember, I'd say. You'll eventually come across the people in there and you're gonna have to talk to them. There's no way around it. I don't want to scare you, but the further you proceed into those woods, the crazier the ones you're gonna meet will be." Noticing my unease, Duncan gave me a quick smile. "It'll be okay. Just hurry, get in and out quickly and avoid the deeper parts if you can. If you stay for too long, the people there and the woods themselves are gonna start messing with your head. It's tricky, everything's different in there, space, time even, just keep that in mind. The whole place is gonna want to screw you over." He let out a husky laugh, though I wasn't sure what he thought was funny. I stood up, thanking him profusely. I couldn't waste any more time. I hoped Chips hadn't gone deeper into the woods in the meantime. I was prepared well enough as I was. I still had all of my dog-walking supplies in my pockets, treats for Chips, pepper spray and handkerchiefs. In case it'd be dark, I'd have to make do with the flashlight on my phone, but that was all right. I headed straight for the woods. I knew where to find the path, I'd walked by it before. Actually stepping onto it, however, felt quite different. There was a strong sense of unease within me all of a sudden. I was barely 2 steps past the tree line and already I felt like I was in a whole other world. Maybe it was all the expectation, the anxiety built by Duncan's instructions, but when I turned to glance behind me, back outside, it looked so far away. The trail was just wide enough for me to stand on. The feeling of dread grew stronger the further I went. The trees around me stood tall and imposing, and in some places their leaves were so lush I couldn't see the sky above. I tried to calm my mind by listening to my surroundings. They say the sounds of nature are the most soothing there are, but somehow, the singing of the birds and the quiet chirping of insects around me only added to my discomfort. Suddenly, there was something else, the sound of water trickling down and hitting the soft forest floor. Slightly startled, I glanced around frantically only to find the source just a few meters ahead of me. It was a man. His back was turned to me and he was facing the tree in front of him. He probably hadn't noticed me yet, so I turned to look away and nervously cleared my throat. "Yeah, I know you're there. Give me a second, will you? Kinda busy here." "Oh. I'm sorry," I stammered, feeling my cheeks heat up. "It's fine." The sound of the liquid running ceased and after 2 more seconds, I dared to turn around to him. I don't know what I'd been expecting, but he wasn't it. I looked him over as discreetly as I could. He was short, about my height and of about the same age as me too. His clothes were fairly normal as well. Jeans, boots and a white flannel shirt, the latter of which just a bit too baggy to flatter his slight frame. His dark, overgrown hair and the stubble on his face made him look a bit unkempt. "Nice to meet you," I said slowly. "If you don't mind, I'd like to ask you something." "I hope it's not." "Don't talk fancy with me, it makes me want to puke." "Got it," I muttered, a bit embarrassed. That had been clear enough though. "Say, do you live here?" "You don't look like." "I do though." "So?" "I'm looking for my dog. She's white with black speckles, pretty big." I held my hand up to my hip to indicate her height. "I haven't seen her," he replied. "And pets don't run in here for no reason." "What do you mean?" "Maybe someone lured it away without you noticing. We can do stuff like that, you know." "I'd watch my back if I were you." I swallowed, holding his gaze. "I appreciate the advice," I finally said. "I'll be on my way." The man in the white shirt gave me an indifferent shrug. "Take care, I guess." I turned to leave with a queasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. Glancing back over my shoulder, I found that the man was gone. Unnerved, I stuck to the path, focusing on looking around without leaving it. I called out for Chips every other minute, hesitant to alert anyone yet hopeful to spot my dog come running towards me from somewhere in the underbrush. No such luck. I did gain someone else's attention though. She appeared right ahead of me, just a few feet off to the side from the path, an elderly woman with long gray hair and a wrinkled face. She was wearing a long, dirty dress that had probably been white at one point. She stood unmoving, even as I kept approaching. I cleared my throat. "Hello," I called out, stopping in my tracks. I didn't want to get too close to her. She didn't answer. "Excuse me, have you seen a dog come through?" I shouted. The woman slowly started walking towards me. Her steps were lumbering and heavy. Her head lowered, her hair fell down to cover her face like a stringy, torn-up veil. Despite her sluggish movements, I was beginning to grow nervous. Something about the way she was stalking towards me made me feel like I was prey about to be lunged at. Not wanting to show my fear, I cautiously backed away. "Don't come any closer," I told her in the most commanding voice I could muster. I reached into my pocket, fumbling for the small can of pepper spray. I had no idea if I'd be able to defend myself with it at all, but I figured it'd be better than nothing. "Please," I said. "I'm not here to hurt you." The old woman extended her hand to touch my face. Her nails were long, sharp and cracked, they looked almost like claws. I didn't dare to move when she ran them through my hair. Her dull eyes staring into mine, I held my breath. What was I supposed to do? Shove her away? I didn't want to risk provoking her. Then, suddenly, she grasped for my throat. I was just fast enough to duck and avoid her twisted, bony fingers. I dashed forward and took off running. My feet drumming on the soft dirt ground, I blindly raced ahead. I felt the can of pepper spray fall out of my open pocket, but I didn't stop to pick it up. Risking a glance over my shoulder, I saw her lumbering after me. She was not very fast though, and I noticed she never once set foot on the path. It was like she needed to stay off it for some reason. Still, that didn't mean she couldn't hurt me. There was a low thud behind me. I staggered to a halt and turned to find that the old woman was lying on the ground, next to her a small rock. It must have hit her on the head, it had obviously caused her to tumble. Despite that, she was already pulling herself back up, and I took off down the trail again. At least this would help me lose her. I kept running until my sides were burning with pain and the sweat from my forehead was dripping down my neck. It was only when I was absolutely sure she wasn't behind me anymore that I finally slowed down. I dropped to my knees. My throat was sore and dry. Taking deep breaths, I sucked in the cool fresh air. I was quietly muttering phrases of reassurance to myself, mixed with the occasional swear word. Suddenly, I heard someone clear their throat. I spun around only to find the man in the white shirt from before standing behind me. He looked rather pleased with himself. "Did you throw that rock?" "I did." "Thank you so much, He silenced me with a dismissive wave of his hand, but he was smiling still. "I bet she's more like what you were expecting to see here." He laughed and shook his head. "Look, I don't really get why you're chasing after that mutt, but for what it's worth, I'm sure it's gonna be interesting to watch. If you'll allow it, I'd like to come along. That'd be mutually beneficial, right? I'm not saying I'll carry you around or anything, but I'd make myself useful, help you out a bit." He drew out his words, leaving them to linger in the air. I didn't need to think about the offer very long. "Yes, please." He allowed his smile to widen, looking excited as he wiped his hands on his pants. "This should be fun." "Plenty," I muttered. "Hey, I know real names are taboo but…" "About that." I overheard two kids walk along the tree line talking a while ago. One was telling this story about someone named Tam Lin. "It's too long to tell you all about it." He almost sounded embarrassed. "But I liked the story so, that's what I'd like for you to call me. Tam Lin." Tam Lin saved me the effort of making up a name of my own, seeing as he simply began calling me Janet. I had little say in it, but I figured complaining wouldn't help. Who was that woman? What did she want? I eventually asked him. We had been walking for a while, me on the path and him beside it. "Who can say? I don't know her personally. We're not like one big family here," he began. "Maybe she wanted to eat you. Or maybe she was lonely and wanted company but didn't know how to go about it. Are there more like her?" "Yes. There's always more. On the plus side, it's rare to come across the aggressive ones. I don't even know what she was doing so close to the path. The likes of her usually stay in hiding." "Right, the path. Why don't you walk on it?" "Because your people put it there," he replied, seemingly thinking this a valid explanation. "It's not our ground to tread on." Tam wasn't uncommunicative. He asked me a lot of things about myself, my everyday life and even my dog. I tried to tell him as much as I could without giving anything away that I shouldn't. He didn't like talking about the woods though, and I suspected he was tired of the topic. It would turn out he was quite the skilled guide. Sometimes, we'd hear odd noises ahead, like shouting or chanting, and he'd make us stay in place until they'd faded into the distance. He could sense when there was somebody ahead we needed to be wary of and told me when it was safe to call for Chips and when to stay silent. Tam himself would occasionally stray from my side and go deeper into the woods in search of the dog so I wouldn't have to leave the path. I watched the sun set through the canopy of leaves above. We hadn't come across anyone else and there was no trace of Chips. I was tired and my feet were starting to hurt. I couldn't believe that the woods were too big to comb through in an entire day. I had never imagined them to be this huge. I thought about calling my parents, but, not wanting to worry them, I decided against it. I lived next door to them, in a much tinier house that also belonged to us. They wouldn't notice my absence for the time being. The forest floor was soft, but still quite unpleasant to sleep on. Tam was obviously completely unfazed by the prospect of resting on the bare ground, but he didn't give me grief for being squeamish. The uncomfort was one thing, but what was worse was that I felt utterly exposed. I spent the night wide awake, restless and afraid. Nothing happened though. When Tam woke up, it was still dark. There was no reason to keep lying around, so we moved on. I saw the sun rise overhead. We kept calling out for Chips but still came up with nothing. Remembering what Duncan had said about the more dangerous inhabitants of the woods living further in the back, I asked Tam if it was true. "I guess," he replied curtly. It made me think. I wasn't feeling well and there was no trace of Chips. The further we'd go in, the more threats there'd be on the way. Was my dog even alive anymore? Maybe, I thought, just maybe it'd be better for me to simply go back. I'm pretty sure Tam knew what I was thinking. He did his best to encourage me, probably afraid to lose his temporary source of entertainment this early on. "Hey, you can do this. I'll keep you safe, okay? Do you need anything? I know where to get you food and water if that's what you want." Water. I had all but forgotten about how thirsty I was. Duncan had told me not to eat or drink here, but he'd also said that if I had to, I could. What other solution was there anyways? Tam assured me that the water was clean and safe to consume. He said he'd fetch it from a nearby creek. He offered to take me with him, but I told him I'd rather stay on the path, otherwise we'd end up lost. A lump in my throat, I watched him walk off. I wasn't thrilled about being on my own, but I knew I was safe on the path. I tried to curl up in the middle of it, hoping to hide myself or at least keep my head low. I felt like an idiot and it wasn't too effective either. My stomach dropped when I suddenly heard multiple sets of footsteps up ahead. The unmistakable crunching of leaves and snapping of twigs came closer and closer, and I nervously stared off into the direction they were coming from. Soon enough, I spotted 4 figures appearing from behind a bunch of hedges. Noticing they were drawing closer, I staggered to my feet. It looked to be 3 women and a man, all of them dressed in rags rather than actual clothing. Carefully staying beside the trail, they slowly walked up to me. The one that came closest first was one of the women. She was tall, almost unnaturally so. Her hair was tousled and reached all the way down to her hip. Her face was covered in a mix of scars and slowly healing open wounds, as though something or someone had scratched and cut it up. The skin around the cuts was frayed and dirty. "Hello." Her tone was almost cordial, but there was something about her voice that threw me off. It didn't sound as though speech came natural to her, more like she was mimicking a noise she'd heard before without understanding the meaning of the word. It was simply off. I returned her greeting, eyes downcast as the other three stepped up to me as well. "Are you here on your own?" the woman asked. "No. I have someone with me, he'll be back soon." "Ah. Where did he go?" She didn't sound like she believed me. "To get water," I muttered. "So he's from the woods?" "Yes." I finally dared to meet her gaze. Her eyes were too wide to look normal. I toyed with the idea of asking her about chips and eventually pressed out the question, shifting my weight from one foot to another uncomfortably. "That dog is yours?" "Oh, I've seen it." Quiet chuckles rippled through the small group as they exchanged knowing glances. "I can show you where, but you'd have to come with us, obviously." She regarded me with a half-smile. I doubted she actually expected me to agree. I would have had to be pretty stupid to do so. "Get back," I told her firmly as she leaned in to sniff my shoulder. She straightened up again. Then one of her companions reached out and before I knew it, she had pushed me and I staggered, landing on my behind on the ground beside the path. Before I could get up again, the tall woman grabbed me by the back of my neck and lifted me to my feet. "See? Now we're on the same page, not that bad, is it?" she hissed softly, that alligator-like smirk still on her chapped, thin lips. "Let go of me," I growled, suppressing the fear in my voice as I struggled and eventually managed to tear out of her grasp, her nails leaving painful marks on my skin. I couldn't get back on the path in time though, as the man from the group had moved in front of me, blocking it off. I stumbled away from him and the tall lady while the other two quickly stepped over the trail to join us on our side. "It's been a while since I last talked to one of your people," the giant woman said, slowly proceeding towards me. "See my face?" she went on, tilting her head. "That was one of you guys. Now, I doubt there's any relation between you and him, but I'm sure you understand my wish to compensate." I didn't care to find out how exactly she wanted to do that. I hastily took off in the opposite direction, praying the head start would allow me to shake them off. I could already hear them starting to run after me. In between gasps for air, I screamed for Tam Lin in the vain hope that he was somewhere nearby. I tried to keep my pace, chasing off birds and critters alike as my leaps slowly turned into lumbering, faltering hops. Like a pack of wolves, the group was still on my heels, and they were catching up, tiring me out. Looking over my shoulder, I saw the tall woman leading her hunting party, a triumphant leer already on her face, when all of a sudden, a figure burst out from the underbrush and lunged at her from the side. The lady was too surprised to react, and before I could blink, the other person had thrown her to the ground. I could see them clearly now and my chest grew light with relief when I recognized Tam Lin. Crouching on the larger woman's chest, he dug his fingers into her face, grabbing onto the flayed edges of her wounded skin and starting to pull. Her scream was blood-curdling, an ear-piercing wail of agony. Her three companions had stopped in their tracks, staring at the scene in shock but not doing anything to stop it. After just a few seconds, Tam got up, in his hand a small, red patch of torn skin which he dropped to the ground as he backed off. What followed was an awkward display. The woman staggered to her feet as we stood and stared. The pack looked back at us in stunned silence. They were first to turn and leave though, and it was only when we couldn't see them anymore that I dared to turn and face Tam Lin. "You left the path," he said, sounding soberly astounded rather than angry. I couldn't speak, my throat sore from all the screaming. Still close to tears, I nodded quietly. Tam swallowed. He looked uneasy, but managed to give me a smile. "It's okay, we'll find it again. We need to get you water first anyways. I found the creek, it's just a little bit ahead. Let's go there first and then we'll look for the trail." I nodded again, following him once more as he led me through the trampled down bushes he'd emerged from. The creek was nice and clear, completely undisturbed in its route through the forest. I didn't bother looking for any sort of cup, I simply dropped to my knees and began to shovel the water into my mouth with both hands. Before long, I dipped my head into it, greedily sucking it up as Tam stood and watched. Once I was full, I let out a deep, content sigh and plopped down in the tall grass. I had forgotten how thirsty I'd been this whole time. We stayed for only a few minutes before making our way back to the path. And that's when disaster struck. There's no way to talk around it. We couldn't find it anymore. We searched all of the surrounding terrain, trying to spot it in the thicket, but to no avail. By the time the sun set, I was starting to panic. I took out my phone, hoping to find a map of this place and perhaps call my parents, only to find that the battery had died. It was completely useless. Night fell and we had to stop and get some rest. Then sunrise came again and we moved on. This cycle would repeat itself 4 times before I lost hope. I still remember the exact moment I realized it was futile. There was no way out anymore. The woods had swallowed it. I was trapped. It took me a long time to accept my fate. I cried for 2 entire days. Tam Lin tried to console me, but despite his good intentions, he failed. I'd never see my parents again. I'd never find myself in the comforts of my home. After these 2 days, however, things changed. I grew melancholy, then oddly content. The woods have an eerily soothing effect on those that it captures, that's the only way I can explain it. I kept looking for Chips, hoping to at least reunite with her one day. We asked everyone we met on our journeys through these endless woods. That's another weird thing, it didn't feel like I was an outsider anymore. The tribespeople, however bizarre and intimidating they'd seem, would treat me as one of their own. I wasn't being hunted anymore. I got used to sleeping on the cold ground, I even began to appreciate it. Whenever I'd rest my head on it, I felt as though I was listening to the earth's heartbeat. Tam Lin and I would sleep side by side like we had during my first night here. Then we moved closer to one another. Then even closer still. I became accustomed to the warmth of his breath on my neck. It was a soft, comforting feeling, him holding my hand and pressing his cheek to mine. One day, he uttered his true name to me and I told him my own. I would rarely feel hunger or thirst anymore, and on the few occasions that I did, the woods would feed me. I think I must have forgotten why I'd gone down that path in the first place. I forgot who I was and what life outside had been like. I even forgot about Chips. I kept on counting the days though, even though I'd forgotten why. 988. That's how many sunrises passed until the day I woke up to barking. I hadn't heard any sounds like it in so long I couldn't even place it at first. My eyes adjusting to the bright sunlight, I could make out something large and dark right above me. When it came down to touch my face, I found it to be wet and warm. A snout. By the time a large, pink tongue came out of it and started to lick the length of my cheek, I was certain. And then it all came back to me. It was my sweet, giant puppy. Her collar was still around her neck, the leash attached to it dirty and caked with mud as it had been dragging behind her all this time. I stared at her for a minute straight before I dared to reach out and touch her, afraid I would find her to be an illusion or some sort of fever dream. My hands met with matted fur and warm skin underneath. I grabbed her, pulled her onto my lap and hugged her tightly. I couldn't believe it. All memory of her had been erased from my mind. For all I knew she could have died in those woods months ago, but there she was. Tam looked on in disbelief. Chips began to hop around, looking excited. She ran ahead for a bit and then returned, almost like she wanted to show me something. I rushed after her and Tam followed. Chips led us through the tall grass and hedges in a weird, bendy route that made me wonder where we were going to end up. We wandered around for almost an entire day before finding ourselves in a spot that looked faintly familiar to me. It's hard to remember details of a place where there is nothing but greenery, but I knew I'd been there before. And then I saw it. The narrow little dirt path. I was going to get home. After all this time, I hadn't even thought of it as possible. My desire to return to my former life was greater than ever, and I was finally hopeful again. I picked up Chip's leash and grabbed Tam by the hand, dragging him along with me as I took up running. I didn't stop, not even when I was starting to get tired. Finally, I saw light up ahead, brighter than the sunlight I'd seen filtered through the leaves. It was the end of the path, the exit. I slowed down, my breathing ragged and strained. Chips nudged my arm with her head and I turned to look back at Tam. "So you're leaving," he said. "Honestly, I didn't think you would. Ever." "Me neither," I admitted. I squeezed his hand before letting go of it. He nodded slowly and reached up to scratch the back of his neck. "I won't lie, with you gone, there's no reason for me to stay any longer either," he muttered. "I thought you'd stay here with me, see? I was happy when we were all by ourselves. I could have left already when you told me your name, but I didn't want to. Well, it doesn't matter anymore, does it?" I stared at him with wide eyes, unable to comprehend what he was saying. He just smiled, walking ahead of me towards the exit. It was only then that I noticed he was walking on the path, just like me. He'd been right behind me this entire time and I hadn't even realized it. Now standing by the edge of the forest, Tam motioned for me to follow. Still utterly confused, I hurried to join him. When we stepped outside the woods, the light was almost blinding. I blinked, but Tam stared up at the bright sky, completely unfazed. "It feels so different here," he breathed, lightly kicking the ground with his boot. "It's not like I imagined, but it's nice." He turned to me with a curious expression. "Is it the way you remembered?" I was too stunned to say a word. Tam tilted his head at me. "You don't have to look so shocked. It was you who told me your name. That meant a lot to me, it still does. Knowing the name of one of your people, it makes us special. It means we can tread on your ground, that we can leave. Not my original goal. I just wanted your company. Before all this, I'd see you every time you walked by the woods with that dog. I was always watching, and I kept wondering what you were like. I made up my little plan and it worked, as you can see." He let out a soft chuckle. "I told you some of us are lonely, so I wasn't completely dishonest with you. I even said that pets don't run off there for no reason. Frowning, he added, "I don't know how Chips found you again. I thought I'd lured her deep enough into the forest for her to never get back. Especially with her little doggy brain. It took me a little while to regain my ability to speak." "You can't be serious." "I figured this would come as a surprise. I was never obvious about it. That's why I didn't come along with you right away either." He gave me an almost sad smile. "Honestly, I feel bad about it, I really do. I know how much you wanted to go home. I was never going to use force to keep you in there, I just kept leading you away from the path once I got the chance. I messed with your head a little, didn't let you see your way home. But it was the woods' influence too." "What? You said you could check the date on your phone. We're outside, it'll work now." "Check." I reached into my pocket, fumbling for my cell phone only to find that I could actually turn it on. It was extremely low on battery, but it worked. A look at the date told me that exactly 3 days had passed since I'd last looked at it. "That's impossible," I breathed. "How?" I counted the days. "That's not my doing. It's the woods. They can make you think a few hours are months and that a week is an eternity. Humans come and go, and all experience that effect." My head swam and there was an odd ringing in my ears. I felt like I was going to pass out. "And you're letting me go?" It was difficult finding and forming those words, but I forced them through my trembling lips nonetheless. "What else am I supposed to do? I don't want to hurt you. I'm just gonna see what this side of the world has to offer. It wasn't my initial plan, but I guess it could be worse. At least it's a change. Do you know how boring it is to stay in the same place for decades? Centuries. We've been there for so long, no wonder some of us have gone insane over time. And when you're in there, you keep seeing the ones outside, you people, and, well, you never think you're gonna get out. Until you do, I guess." I stared at him with wide, incredulous eyes, my mouth agape. Tam Lin took my hand again, seemingly trying to look encouraging. I would have pulled away, had it not been for me being frozen in place. "I'm gonna be good, I promise," he said softly, an almost childlike glee in his gaze. "I won't hurt anybody here. I'll make myself fit in just fine. Besides, things worked out for the one you called Duncan as well." Fifth story. In the dense woods of upstate New York, near the Great Lakes, there existed a desolate town called Blackwood. It was a place where secrets whispered through the rustling leaves, and shadows clung to the ancient trees like a curse. Legend spoke of a malevolent force, a creature that hungered for human flesh and lurked in the depths of the forest, a Wendigo. The townsfolk seldom spoke of the creature that haunted their nightmares, but its presence was felt in the bone-chilling wind that swept through the towering pines. Blackwood was a town frozen in fear, and the locals lived in constant dread of the Wendigo's return. The story began on a frigid winter night when a group of adventurous friends decided to embark on a camping trip near the Forbidden Woods. Among them were Alex, the level-headed leader, Sarah, the fearless explorer, Mark, the joker of the group, and Emily, the bookish and intuitive one. Excitement filled the air as they set up camp, unaware of the ancient evil that watched their every move. As darkness fell, the temperature plummeted, and an eerie silence enveloped the forest. The friends gathered around a crackling campfire, the flames casting dancing shadows that seemed to mimic the forest's hidden terrors. Unknown to them, an old man from Blackwood had been watching, his weathered face etched with concern. He approached the camp, his voice trembling as he warned the friends of the Wendigo's curse. They laughed it off as the ramblings of a superstitious old man, dismissing the legend as mere folklore. The night wore on, and the forest whispered its secrets to the unsuspecting campers. Unbeknownst to them, the Wendigo had awakened from its slumber, drawn by the scent of intruders in its territory. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly hunger as it silently stalked its prey. As the friends settled into their tents, a bone-chilling howl echoed through the woods, freezing them in terror. The temperature dropped even further, and the wind whispered a warning that went unnoticed. The Wendigo had set its sights on its victims. One by one, the friends were lured into the heart of the forest, drawn by inexplicable whispers that promised unimaginable secrets. Each step took them deeper into the Wendigo's lair, their breath visible in the freezing air. As the group unraveled, paranoia set in. Shadows seemed to dance menacingly, and the once familiar trees morphed into grotesque figures. Mark, the Joker, became the first victim, his laughter turning into desperate pleas as he vanished into the darkness. Sarah, the fearless explorer, followed next, her bravado replaced by a primal fear that echoed through the silent night. Alex and Emily clung to each other, the weight of the Wendigo's curse pressing down on them like a vice. Days turned into nights, and the once joyful camping trip became a harrowing descent into madness. The friends' sanity eroded as the Wendigo toyed with their minds, feeding off the fear that permeated the air. They were trapped in a nightmarish labyrinth, unable to escape the malevolent force that hunted them. In a desperate attempt to break free, Alex and Emily sought the guidance of the old man from Blackwood. He revealed the tragic history of the Wendigo, a curse born from cannibalism and an insatiable hunger that tormented the soul. The only way to appease the creature was to sacrifice that which they held most dear. Torn between their love for each other and the need to survive, Alex and Emily faced an impossible choice. As the Wendigo closed in, its haunting presence consuming their every thought, they made a heartbreaking decision to sacrifice themselves for the sake of the other. In the final moments, as the Wendigo's icy breath enveloped them, Alex and Emily whispered their goodbyes, their love transcending the bounds of life and death. The forest, once a place of horror, fell silent, as if mourning the tragic fate of the ill-fated friends. The legend of the Wendigo lived on in Blackwood, a cautionary tale passed down through generations. The old man, burdened by the weight of witnessing the cycle repeat, continued to warn those who dared to venture into the forbidden woods. And so, the chilling winds of upstate New York carried the echoes of a haunting tale, a tale of a Wendigo that lurked in the shadows, its hunger never truly sated, and the doomed souls who crossed its path in the desolate town of Blackwood. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.